On a foggy morning in January, the crew of a Boeing 747 freighter is attempting to land in thick fog at an airport in Kyrgyzstan. In fact, the fog is so thick that on this day, the two pilots have to let the autopilot land the aircraft all by itself. A task that is routinely done around the globe, but one that requires great focus and discipline by the pilots. Initially, all seems to be going smoothly until suddenly, the pilots attempt to go around at the very last second before touchdown. But their attempt fails horribly, and just moments later, the plane slams into nearby trees and houses. What happened here? Did the 747's autopilot malfunction, or was there something else at play? Let's find out. Welcome to airspace. On January 16, 2017, Turkish Airlines Flight 6491 departed Hong Kong for a cargo flight to Istanbul, with a transit stop in Manas, Kyrgyzstan. The flight was in fact not operated by Turkish Airlines itself, but by another Turkish airline by the name of ACT Airlines. This is a small cargo airline that operates out of Istanbul. Its business consists mainly of carrying out freight operations for other airlines such as Turkish Airlines or Saudia Cargo. After departure, the two pilots as well as a loadmaster and a cargo handler settled in for their flight to Manas. It should be an uneventful, quiet night flight until finally, the Boeing 747 reached the top of descent. Now, the workload of the crew increased a bit, as is common for this phase of the flight. To determine what runway and approach type was being used at Manas, the first officer obtained the latest weather report. It showed calm winds, freezing temperatures, and above all, the presence of fog providing a pretty low visibility. On the ground, the runway visual range, which is just a fancy term of saying how far down the runway you can see, was just 350 meters or roughly 1,200 feet. For the two pilots, this effectively meant that the visibility was too low to carry out a standard approach. Instead, an automatic landing would have to be performed. In an automatic landing, the captain performs a landing that is entirely done by the autopilots of the plane. He will look outside to see whether the required visual cues will be met at the last second before touchdown. Meanwhile, the first officer monitors the instruments very closely and alerts the captain if the performance of any system is not up to par. This is a standard procedure that pilots have to train every few months in a simulator, and most pilots get to do a few of those low visibility operations every year. As the pilots of Turkish 6491 started their descent, the captain began briefing the first officer about the procedure to be flown. Such a low visibility procedure requires a rather extensive briefing since many additional eventualities have to be covered, such as actions in case of late autopilot failure, or what has to be done if the weather deteriorates further. After the pilots had finished their briefing, they were cleared by air traffic control to approach Manas from the southeast on a standard arrival route called Topka 1. Compared to other routes, this one is very simple and consists of only two waypoints, Raksat and Topka. Both waypoints have published minimum altitudes of 6,000 feet and 17,000 feet respectively, which means that this waypoint may not be crossed below these altitudes. This is due to the fact that there is a mountain range just south of the airport that extends in the west-east orientation. But soon, the crew of Turkish 6491 found itself struggling with this arrival route. From their point of view, they seemed to come in rather high. As they were still approaching the mountain range while being in clouds, they requested multiple times to descend lower, but their requests were all denied due to the fact that it was simply not safe to do so due to the mountain range below. But as soon as the 747 had cleared the mountain range, the controller in charge cleared the flight down to 6,000 feet as per the procedure. In the cockpit, the captain's mood was sour. He started cursing about the air traffic controller and about the fact that the captain felt that the controller had left the flight in a position too high for the approach. Despite all the F words used, the crew continued their approach. But when they reached the next waypoint on their arrival route, they found themselves even higher. Still, they continued the approach without complaining to air traffic control. When the aircraft finally intercepted the localizer, that is the horizontal part of the beams that guide the plane to the runway, it was still way too high. Here, the aircraft should have been nicely configured, with flaps and the landing gear out, at an altitude of 3,400 feet, which corresponds to just 1,400 feet above the ground at this position. Instead, The crew of this 747 found itself at an altitude of 5,300 feet, which is 1,900 feet too high. In other words, the flight was not coming in a little bit too high, but an approach from this position should have been pretty much impossible in a Boeing 747. Still, the crew continued and finally leveled off at 3,400 feet. Here, they waited for the autopilots to capture the glide slope, the vertical guidance part of the instrument landing system. In the meantime, they managed to slow their huge plane down enough to lower the flaps and the landing gear. Finally, and miraculously, the autopilots captured the glide slope and started to follow it. The plane now descended along the glide slope for a while at a rate of descent of almost 1,500 feet per minute, which is almost double the normal expected value. The crew did not recognize this discrepancy and continued their approach. But 15 seconds later, the Boeing 747's warning computers issued several warnings: Autopilot Caution and Fma Fault 2. These two warnings should have raised more than just an eyebrow in the flight crews. As per the flight manuals, the Fma Fault 2 warning indicates that the autopilots are no longer able to follow the glide slope and that they have reverted to a basic mode. This basic mode just maintains a descent angle of -3 degrees, regardless of any external signal. But the crew ignored those warnings and just continued their approach as if nothing was amiss. They did also not reconsider when one of their 3 autopilots disengaged unexpectedly a few seconds later. When the aircraft was just 300 feet above the ground proximity warning system issued 5 separate glide slope alerts. This alert is loud and is designed to warn the crews that they have deviated dangerously from the safe glide slope. At this low altitude, this alert should have prompted the crew to go around immediately. But for some reason, this crew ignored all the alerts, even though they had vowed in the approach briefing just 20 minutes before to immediately react should such a warning occur. The captain continued the approach down to the very minimum descent height, which was just 99 feet above the ground for this approach. Here, the crew realized that they couldn't see the runway and finally decided to go around. The captain pushed the toga buttons on the thrust levers, which prompted the powerful engines of the 747 to spin up. Together with the captain's pitch input on the control column, this prompted the 747 to initially level off, while the engine slowly started to produce thrust. But 3 seconds later, the aircraft unexpectedly touched down. In horror, the crew now saw that they were in fact not on a runway, but on soft, snowy ground. Thudding sounds echoed through the plane as its wings impacted trees. Just a blink of an eye later, the massive plane broke through the concrete airport perimeter wall and impacted buildings beyond. In a huge ball of fire, the fuel left in the tanks erupted and engulfed the scene in flames. Local fire crews and ambulances quickly responded to the scene and attacked the flames. The scene they found must have been apocalyptic. The Boeing 747 had plowed through many houses, most of which had been occupied in the early morning hours. By noon on the day of the accident, over 1,000 rescue workers were at the scene. They were able to save 14 people on the ground. In the wreckage of the plane, they found the bodies of 3 crew members. The captain was found strapped to his seat, still breathing. He was cut loose from his harness and was rushed to a nearby hospital, but unfortunately he perished in the ambulance. By the end of the day, 39 casualties had been reported. Headlines quickly spread around the globe that yet another Turkish Airlines plane had crashed, but Turkish Airlines was quick to point out that this was no Turkish Airlines plane, but merely one that had been chartered by the company. Investigators were dispatched to the scene to find out what had transpired in the cockpit on that fateful winter morning. To assist the Kyrgyz authorities, the American NTSB as well as Turkish investigators joined in on the investigation. Luckily, the flight recorders were quickly located and analyzed. From them, analysts were able to reconstruct what had happened. Let's go back to the top of descent of Flight 6491. When the captain briefed his first officer on how he would conduct a low visibility approach, he included all the required briefing points regarding the final approach itself. However, he failed to address the special descent profile imposed by the arrival route into Manas Airport. You see, while the approach into Manas looks very straightforward, there is a small pitfall. Due to the surrounding terrain, aircraft have to remain high, above 17,000 feet up until here, the waypoint called Raksat. After this, the plane needs to descend moderately steeply. From Raksat until touchdown, there are only 41 nautical miles left to fly down to the runway if the plane is to take the most direct route along the arrival route. This is by no means impossible, but it requires a plan and effort by the crew to make it happen. You see, aircraft are made to fly, which means that descending quickly can sometimes be a challenge. A good rule of thumb is that to descend 1000 feet, a plane needs about 3 nautical miles of distance on a normal trajectory. If we do some back of the napkin math right here, we can see that from 17,000 feet at Raksat, we would need 45 miles to perform a nice 3 degrees standard descent down to the airport elevation of 2000 feet. But alas, only 41 nautical miles are available. The solution would be to deploy the speed brakes on top of the wing, to deploy the flaps or the landing gear to increase drag, or a combination of all of these measures. But as it would seem, the crew did nothing of all this and initially just descended in a haphazard way. This eventually brought them into a position that was too high for the approach. To properly intercept the glide slope to Manas runway 26, the plane should have arrived at a point 5.4 miles away from the runway at an altitude of 3,400 feet. A normal flight would then just fly straight for a short while, intercept the glide slope and follow it down to the runway. But Flight 6491 arrived at the 5.4 mile point at 5,300 feet, a whopping 1,900 feet too high. From that point, it was impossible to intercept the glide slope, since it extended below them. By this time, the crew had lost the awareness about their position completely. They were aware that they were coming in high, but they still expected to intercept the glide slope from their position, so they continued their descent to 3,400 feet, almost parallel to the actual glide slope, and then leveled off. Now, you would expect that from their position above the glide slope, the flight would have just continued to fly level until the crew could finally have realized that the glide slope capture would no longer happen. But here, I have to explain a small system particularity about the glide slope to you. You see, the standard glide slopes are usually formed by 2 signal lobes that overlap. Here, where they overlap, you'll find the normal glide slope that pilots use. It normally sits at 3 degrees. But due to the nature of the signal being emitted, another inverse glide slope forms, by 2 side lobes at an angle of 9 degrees. This is a normal phenomenon that occurs in every glide slope, and this should be known to all pilots who fly these types of approaches. Normally, this is no problem, since flights usually don't come into contact with these side lobes on normal approaches. But the crew of Turkish 6491 found itself high and above the normal glide slope, while still expecting to capture it. Later, way past the normal glide slope, they flew level at 3,400 feet, and finally, their glide slope receivers found a signal, but the wrong one. They latched onto the 9-degree glide slope and attempted to follow it. An impossible endeavor, since no 747 will be able to fly a final approach at an angle this steep in stable conditions. Still, the pilots believed that they had found the correct glide slope and acted accordingly. But 15 seconds later, the autopilots realized that they were unable to follow this false glide slope and stopped. To signal to pilots that they were now unable to track the glide slope, the warnings Autopilot Caution and Fma Fault 2 were issued. Here, the pilots should have realized that something was wrong and a go-around should have been performed. But the pilots ignored the warnings. In this degraded mode, the plane now just tracked a -3 degrees descent angle, which took the aircraft in a descent that slowly brought it towards the end of the runway. All the while, the pilots believed that they were on the correct glide slope. Even when the computers literally shouted in their faces, glide slope, the pilots failed to realize that they were sorely mistaken. Seconds later, the plane crossed the runway end, not the runway beginning, the runway end, at 110 feet. The plane descended into slowly rising terrain, and finally, the captain attempted to perform a go-around when he could not see the runway at the minimum descent height of 99 feet above the ground. But it was too late. The plane did not climb quickly enough to escape the rising terrain and slammed to the ground, the airport perimeter wall, and the buildings beyond. Once again, negligence, poor planning, and even poorer adherence to procedures doomed a flight that could have been saved if the pilots would have stopped to think at just one of the many crossroads they faced. Each and every warning, be it the Autopilot Caution, Fma Fault 2, or glide slope warnings, should have triggered the pilots to stop and think about their actions. But it seems that they were so focused on getting to their destination that they never considered that they maybe have botched their approach completely. The final report lists the lack of control of the crew over their aircraft position as the main cause of the accident. In addition to that, it was found that if the crew had performed a better approach briefing, maybe they would have been more aware of the fact that decreasing their altitude efficiently was the main concern of this approach. Also, the air traffic controller was not very helpful and did not offer to increase the distance of their approach so that the crew could better decrease their altitude. And finally, psycho-emotional stress is also listed as a factor in this accident. During the approach, the captain swore a lot and cursed the approach controller for his, in the view of the captain, poor descent clearances. In fact, all these clearances were in accordance with standard procedures and should have been expected by the captain. All in all, this flight is an example of a concatenation of failures in human performance and adherence to standard procedures. If you want to take a lesson away from this terrible crash, it is that a good plan always helps. Had this crew planned their descent more accurately, they would have never gotten themselves into this dire situation. Also, adherence to procedures is paramount. There is no reason not to follow good procedures, and this accident is a prime example of this. Had the crew followed standard procedures, they would not have found themselves in this situation, and even if, they would have had the chance to go around and try again at so many points in the approach. Their failure to do so eventually cost them not only theirs, but the lives of 37 other people. I hope you liked my account of this tragic story. If you did, make sure to like and subscribe, it really helps the channel. If you wish to support my work in the longer term, check out my Patreon. I offer many cool benefits such as early and ad-free access to my videos and even occasional giveaways. That said, thank you so much for watching and see you all in the next one.